Welcome into the play-by-play, a sports media talk show from Awful Announcing, where, like Vince McMahon, we hope the viewer will keep an open mind and remember there are two sides to every story. I'm Brendon, Kleen, a staff writer at Awful Announcing. That over there is Ben Axelrod, a senior editor at Awful Announcing. We're back with you again. Happy Wednesday. Wherever you're finding us, hit follow or subscribe. Get along. We're here every week. We got three big stories. We have a guest, our first guest ever on the show, Lyndsey D'Arcangelo of Awful Announcing and a bunch of other places, has been covering the WNBA for a while. She's going to help us sift through our takeaways of this crazy WNBA season and Caitlin Clark's arrival in the pros. We're also going to FX, where Aaron Hernandez has a show for some reason, and we're talking Cris Collinsworth. That is where we will start. Let's get right into it, Ben. Collinsworth, I think, was the guy that a lot of people expected might be the first one, or the next one to retire, the next one to maybe leave his post, be available. That NBC job, if you're a Dan Orlovsky, you're a Greg Olson, that's the one you're vying for because he's older than a Tony Romo or a Tom Brady. That's not the case. He now gets a contract extension. Andrew Marchand of The Athletic broke the news last week. New 4-year deal extending beyond the 2026 season, which was already quite a ways out of this current deal, and he will be in that NBC chair through the 2030 season. I think he's calling 2 Super Bowls in that time frame, or at least 2 over the remainder of this contract, at least. And the most long-tenured guy in this business doing what he does is going to stick around a little longer. We'll get to the maybe trickles of everybody else's role in all this, but just from a Collinsworth standpoint, what did you think?
Yeah, definitely, I think, surprising. He's 65 years old. I think this will take him until he's 71 years old. So definitely on the older side as far as the, primary analysts, when you look at Tony Romo at CBS and obviously Tom Brady at Fox and Troy Aikman at ABC/ESPN. But, it does give them consistency. They did just have the move going from Al Michaels to Mike Tirico as the play-by-play man. But I do think that you look at the landscape of the networks in terms of the NFL, and the NBC booth is kind of ripe for a reboot in terms of, all the other networks. We even talked about CBS. I mean, CBS is the one network that's kind of been set in its way as far as its NFL presentation, and even they freshened some things up with the NFL today. But I definitely thought it was surprising because I think you look at this game of musical chairs, and as you alluded to there, and NBC looked like, in terms of the analyst role, it definitely looked, to me at least, like it was going to be the next one to open up.
Do you like Cris Collinsworth? I think he can be everybody. It's so dumb to even say any game analyst is polarizing because everyone becomes polarizing because people just love to argue about these guys. Do you appreciate him? I will tell you, we have a rule growing up in my household: Sunday Night Football, muted, not allowed to be on. I don't feel that way. That is my stepfather's views of things. But I spent a lot of time watching and not listening to NBC football games because of how little he liked Cris Collinsworth.
He's not my favorite. I don't dislike his analysis to the point that I have to mute the television. There's also, to me, in terms of all the analysts, he's the only one I don't remember watching. Like, I remember watching Troy Aikman, obviously Tom Brady and Tony Romo too. And so I have at least that connection with them. Cris Collinsworth, I don't have that connection to. He definitely has a very distinct style. It's not for everybody. I do like, that he has been willing to adapt to analytics and PFF and all that kind of stuff. He's an investor in PFF. There's definitely some head scratching stuff, like when he just totally misremembered the rules of overtime. I think it was in week 1 this year. So not my favorite, but also not the strongest take from me here. He's there. He's background noise for me.
Got it. I find myself over time and thinking about it, analyzing it more since I started working here. Like, I kind of like Collinsworth and Aikman the most. Like I kind of want that. I just want a capable, steady, tell me what just happened quickly and let's keep it moving. I don't need exuberance. I don't need the smartest dude I've ever heard. I love Greg Olson. I think we've talked about that, but he kind of blends both in a really good way. I think that's why I like him. But I just think Collinsworth and Aikman both, it's like they just know what's going on. They've been, and it really is the experience of doing this job. I don't care what they did as NFL players. It's the experience as an analyst that really comes through that I just appreciate and that feels comfortable, I think, the more that I watch it. But again, I mean, that's not me saying the dude's a genius. I just think he's really capable, and Tirico is even maybe more so. So it's like that broadcast is just very, very in the pocket, and I think NFL fans just kind of appreciate that about it. So great to keep it together.
I've spent some time, like you said, since starting this job, and you and I both started here just over a year ago, thinking more about these broadcast teams and thinking about these networks presentations. And I really think, and I might have mentioned this in an earlier episode or even a test episode we did, but I think that Sunday Night Football broadcast in general, I think is kind of ripe for a reboot. Sunday Night Football is the top draw each week. Like, that is the most watched game each NFL week. And
the most watched broadcast in the world or in the country every week. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the most watched television show that exists for all intents and purposes. Yeah. And man, you don't see that star power from the pregame show. You don't see it from, I don't think necessarily the booth, even though, Mike Tirico is a top of the line play-by-play man, and Cris Collinsworth is well-established and has probably called, half a dozen Super Bowls by now. Like I said, he doesn't have appeal necessarily, at least as a former player, to anybody under the age of 40 at this point. And then I think you look at the pregame show and the halftime show, it's Chris Sims, it's Devin McCourty, it's Maria Taylor, and it's Jason Garrett. Like, how is Jason Garrett an analyst on the top television show?
Well, we know the answer. It's a star. It rhymes with Schmau Boys. Yeah.
But like, that is like a very,
it's not a good reason.
Yeah. It's not like he's Jimmy Johnson. It's not like he's even Emmitt Smith, who
he's like one coach that actually Jerry Jones did cut bait with eventually. You know what I mean? Right. That's what he's known for, is the one that they couldn't be patient with.
Right. I don't know. I mean, you're NBC, you have the top show in the world. I don't know how you don't want more star power. Chris Sims is another guy who's polarizing. He pales in comparison, at least in terms of star power, to a lot of the guys on the other networks. I just think NBC, there's always this push and pull with how much do the personalities and the analysts matter when it's the actual game that's the draw. I think you could argue that NBC is probably the one that's put that theory to the test the most.
I have a hope, maybe it's somewhere between a conspiracy theory and optimism, that maybe them having to start fresh with their NBA slate and their NBA crew and team and just the tone and everything, maybe that'll trickle up, like, back to the NFL. And if they can nab somebody that really impresses or is really young and interesting for that, and they get really high marks, maybe that is the one thing that can put a dent into the way that they've approached this stuff. I just think the exact thing you said of why it could use some refreshing just because it's so popular is why it's not going to, because it's so popular. They don't need to change it, So I think that's the tough part, to convince anybody, hey, they've added new faces and new voices. It's just really not different in tone and style than anything else. Like you mentioned, Jason Kelce would have been a nice pursuit for them because it just would have been new, and they haven't done new in a while. And Collinsworth and Tirico are nobody's idea of new. They've both been in our lives for 20 plus years. I just looked it up. Cris Collinsworth has been broadcasting the NFL in some way, shape, or form since 1989. Yeah,
that sounds about right. I mean, he retired like in the late 80s. So
yeah.
I was born in 1988.
My only memories of him back then are the clips you'll see of him being a womanizer and trying to kind of like he would go do remote like reports. There's one that goes around of him at like a dance club, and he's just like all kinds of young Cris Collinsworth hot or whatever, and he's like going around, and Yeah, I guess that is long in the past, and he is no longer that fresh guy, but he's been around for a while. Let's get to the domino effect here, though, because I mean, anytime we've been covering for a while at Awful Announcing the open pursuit by both Dan Orlovsky and Greg Olsen, not to mention, I'm sure you and I could come up with 5 others who might be good candidates for this, and they would talk about it, or it would be posited that they could jump up at some point. It was always this seat because Romo's young. We knew the Brady thing was coming. Aikman just went to ESPN. He's not going anywhere anytime soon, and he's not too old himself. And now that's not happening. So how do you feel if you're Dan Orlovsky or Greg Olsen? Is it just over, or are you on the phone with Netflix, or what's the deal here?
I think you are in Awful Announcing's DMs trying to point out every mistake that Tom Brady makes in hopes that he'll get some negative press and we'll have enough of it and get out of the broadcast booth. I'm still of the opinion that this Tom Brady thing is not for long. And even if he hits the over on the 1 year mark that I set, like I can't imagine Tom Brady's doing this for like 5+ years. Like I do not see broadcasting being the next chapter of Tom Brady's life for the long term. So I do think Fox will reopen. And I do think, like, obviously they would just hire Greg Olsen or promote Greg Olsen if he's still at Fox at that point. But it's kind of bizarre. Like, for as polarizing as all of these broadcasters are, I think Collinsworth is polarizing. I think Tony Romo is certainly polarizing. I think Troy Aikman to a lesser degree is polarizing. I mean, obviously Tom Brady is at this point, but it's just kind of weird.
Aikman used to have the thing that he wasn't negative enough. And I think he's kind of corrected that. So yeah, he's probably the most widely loved at this point, and he's on the biggest, high profile broadcast. So I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think just like him and Buck have become such an entity together that, like, nobody wants to criticize that team, nor necessarily should they, because I think if you were to ask me what the best team is, like, I think that is the best team in terms of calling.
And Buck
the NFL.
Is so critical that it's like you almost need Aikman to smooth it out a little bit, right? Like, Buck is just so loud in, like, the not the volume, but just the tone of how he does it. So yeah, it's good. It's the tandem that works. But back to what you were saying.
Well, I just think it's funny. All these analysts are polarizing to varying degrees. And I think the one who isn't is Greg Olsen, and he doesn't have a top job. It's weird that this one guy is out there who everybody seems to love. Everybody, I don't know anybody who's like, man, I cannot stand Greg Olsen in the broadcast booth. He's called Super Bowls before. He's obviously plenty capable of it. And it's just weird that he's the guy, he's the odd man out in all of this, that obviously he doesn't have the same star power as Aikman or Romo or Brady. But it's just funny that for as much as we are critical of these things, like, the networks clearly see it in a different light.
Yeah, I guess the other one we haven't mentioned is Kirk Herbstreit, right? That is kind of in a similar vein as Brady, I guess you could say, where we're not exactly sure how long Kirk is going to be doing that job. I mean, he's going to be on game day and the, big ESPN game each weekend for however long he wants to, but he's never really seemed to love doing that. I don't think people have received him super well. Al Michaels will be done at some point. Does that present a natural evolution? So that job's there. Calling Thursday Night Football for Amazon Prime Video. And, as their package expands over time, potentially there might be more opportunities to not just call that Thursday game for 14, 15 weeks a year like they do now. But Olsen staying at Fox seems to make the most sense. We're doing this after Dan Orlovsky just got his one game a year. I believe it's only one still. And it was an awful blowout that did not get to showcase himself, Louis Riddick, and Chris Fowler whatsoever. I think that booth has been pretty good the past few years when I've tuned into it. I didn't watch last night because the game was out of hand before I even sat down on my couch. Is he the number 2 guy for you? Like, is that how you kind of think of the pecking order? Olsen, Orlovsky, or are there other names?
I guess he would be, because he puts himself out there and it's something that he clearly wants. And so
good marketing.
I don't think this is a job like, you can do unless it's something you're actively seeking, nobody's jumping out to me at this moment. Like I really like Ryan Clark, but I don't know if I could imagine him in the booth. I guess the other one would be Jason Kelsey, just because I did think he was that impressive on Monday Night Football when he joined the Aikman and Buck booth. And you don't know how much of that is just being with, like we said, the top broadcast team. But I think, I still think the Monday Night Countdown platform is too small for Jason Kelsey. I think, I don't know. He seems to like it. And he seems to like this, thing where he's going viral every week because he makes some funny comment or says tits on air or something. But I don't know. I just think when you're paying Jason Kelsey what ESPN's paying Jason Kelsey, it seems like too small of a platform for him to just be a fourth voice on another panel with, other ex-players. So I think it would be Greg Olsen and Jason Kelsey and Dan Orlovsky. Those are the three that stand out to me as kind of next in line.
Chase Daniel could be one. He's risen pretty quickly. I mean, maybe not next year, but he is everywhere. He clearly still, just inhales football, and he fits that same. I mean, he is Dan Orlovsky, just like 5 years on a delay, right? I mean, he's the journeyman backup QB who we all know of, but never really heard about it. Oh, wow, he's pretty smart. I could see an executive falling in love with that, and it seems like he could do the job. I have no idea if he'll be good at it.
Yeah, he's somebody, just because he doesn't have the star power, he probably needs to like climb the rungs a little bit and do some MAC college football games or
sure,
talk
to the CW or something. Get on some of those. Yeah.
I don't think he necessarily jumps to the front of the line. What about RG3? RG3's out there. He has experience in the booth and has a lot of star power.
I think he will be back by next football season, right? I mean, he'll be somewhere. The podcast will kind of keep him in the mix. He could do an interview anytime he wants, and somebody will pick up the phone. He's young. He's not going to be forgotten about, and I think he'll be somewhere. Probably college, but I think he could rise. Yeah, to me, Ryan Clark he's like the next Michael Strahan or the next, Nate Burleson to me. He's a guy that's going to keep his foot in the football world, but he's going to do that other stuff too. He's going to be on a morning show or whatever, the 2030s version of these shows is. I don't even know where the media is headed. And then we've talked about people like Peter Schrager, Mina Kimes, folks like that are a little bit, the Tony Kornheiser mold. And that could be a direction to go. But, Philip, our lovely producer, just posted that Chase Daniel is in fact doing games for literally the CW. So our joke landed us exactly where, that's exactly
what he should be doing.
Yeah, perfect. Look at that. We could do this job. We could be execs. We just got to put some suits on instead of our hats and hoodies here. But all right, let's jump to scripted television, Ben. We haven't talked about this world yet here on the play-by-play. It doesn't really fit the name of the podcast a lot, but in this case, sports is intersecting, and also sports media. Domonique Foxworth of ESPN was a writer on this show, did a little media blitz to promote it last week and the week before. We are now 3 or 4 episodes in. I caught up. I watched one last night, so I can only speak to the premiere. I did get through it. It's a continuation of the Ryan Murphy expanded universe at FX. So that's like the Bill Clinton show. That is like American Horror Story. It's
American Blank Story. American Blank
exactly.
Story.
And this is the first American sports story. But it's also very similar to, in my opinion, I didn't even watch this show because it got such bad publicity, but the Clipped show that FX also did that was in relationship to the Ramona Shelburne reporting about the Donald Sterling incident. That's not part of this, but it's just all these kinds of retellings of recent history or things like that, and these 8 to 10 episode seasons. And this one is the most saturated, turned up to 110% version of any of this. It was just a lot to take in. What are your thoughts? How many of you watched, first of all? I'm sure you've watched a little more than me, and what are your thoughts on it so far?
So I've watched the first 2 episodes. I think at the time we're recording this, only 2 are available, but by the time the listeners hear this, the first 4 or maybe first 3 will be available. Okay. So this is American Sports Story, the Aaron Hernandez story, which it's weird they made that distinction because it could also just be American Crime Story and be the Aaron Hernandez story. So like these shows typically appeal to me because I like, reliving some of this stuff just because there's like oddly some nostalgia associated with it. And it takes you back to like Aaron Hernandez's Florida teams and obviously his Patriots teams. And then just like kind of the media circus surrounding when, the murders happened. And also, so this all happened in 2013. I was 2 years out of college covering Ohio State and Urban Meyer. So I had kind of like a natural connection to it. I want
to hear your thoughts on the actor they picked to play Urban.
Just wait till episode 2. Because they really, like when they send in the Emmy reel, episode 2 is going to be the actor playing Urban Meyer's.
Awesome.
That's going to be his Picasso piece. But so I typically like these series, or at least I'm intrigued by them. I watched the OJ one that FX previously did. Like I didn't think it was great, but it kept me entertained and I watched it. So when I saw the trailer for this one, I was obviously drawn to it just to even watch the trailer in the first place. But I watched the trailer and I'm just like, man, I can't get past the actor. Like I just cannot get past this actor portraying Aaron Hernandez because he does not look like Aaron Hernandez to me. And I'm so, I know what Aaron Hernandez looked like and he doesn't look like a football player. And I watched the actor doesn't look like a football player. And so I watched Domonique Foxworth's interview on the Dan Le Batard Show. Domonique Foxworth was a writer on the show. I think he wrote the 5th episode, so that will probably come out sometime next week. But
I was looking it up, and I think he actually wrote the 2nd as well. I think it's 2 and 5. So yeah, the 2nd, which you've seen, was him as well.
Okay, that makes sense because there are some more football elements in the 2nd episode. That's when Aaron gets to Florida, but I couldn't get past the trailer. But Dominique's interview kind of left me with an open mind because he said, it's hard to cast football players. Actors don't typically look like football players, and I like Dominique's worth. If he's on it, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. So I watched it. Man, I could not get past the actor. He does not remind me in any way of Aaron Hernandez. And the writing just kind of left me wondering, like, I guess, who is this for? Because I don't want to say like it's excusing Aaron Hernandez's behavior because I think in a lot of ways it's explaining it, but it does kind of paint him, at least through the first 2 episodes, as a sympathetic figure who is just a victim of his circumstances, the family he grew up in. And then the other part to me is they spend a lot of time focusing on this idea that he was repressed as a homosexual. And that's been out there. That's been reported on. I think there's, verified reports that was the case, but to me, it feels almost like they're going for shock value with it. And I think in 2024, there's just not a lot of shock value about somebody being gay. And so to me, like the fact that at least through the first 2 episodes, that is such a central theme in a show that ultimately we know is going to wind up becoming about him being a murderer. Like to me,
serial murderer, literally.
Yeah. Like a serial murder. It misses the note for me. So it kind of leaves me, and I'm not somebody who needs, a protagonist or an antagonist in every show I watch. I like stuff with shades of gray, but it's just the show. I guess I don't know what I'm watching it for. Like I don't, other than the nostalgia that I mentioned, like I'm not going to like Aaron Hernandez. I know by the end of this, I just don't know who it's for necessarily.
Yeah. I want to go back to the distinction that you made at the beginning there of that it could have just been part of their American Crime Story series and still fit. I think that was the main issue that I came on first is why are they trying to cram so much into this? I don't really care about, especially, I know like episode 1 is kind of just generally setting the stage, but that was almost entirely made up. We have no idea about any of that, how his relationship was directly with his family and things like that. I would assume that the concussion in high school was probably at least factually accurate. That part, you mentioned the stuff about him being, gay potentially, and that factoring into how his life played out, but they're also just, in my opinion, it feels like they are trying to drill in that he had CTE.
Mm-hmm.
The hits to the helmet that they like zoom in on and do these weird effects, and he hits the ground, and then obviously he gets, I don't even know, it seemed like even more significant than a regular concussion that he's at the hospital for in that first episode. And they're talking about it. You can't even watch TV. You got to lay low, do whatever. It's like, again, something that has been speculated about, but to just establish it as like canon, as like this is just how this guy's life was, it does feel like it's just laying breadcrumbs for explaining away. And yeah, you mentioned like it doesn't need to have a protagonist and an antagonist, and there's gray, but I don't really know if we need to have morally gray here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We can have like morally right and wrong, and then why, like the OJ stories, the real documentary on ESPN and then the FX show both did pretty well, where it's like this guy was pretty fucked up, but there are some reasons, so let's talk about them. This feels like this guy did all these things because of this, and it's like, I mean, okay, do the people whose family members got killed care? I mean, no, of course they don't. So I don't know. I mean, I agree. I'm a big fan of Domonique's, and the guy who made the show, the main creator, seems to be very experienced. I mean, I've never written a TV show, so whatever. But you know what it came across to me as is if you ever play the My Player mode in NBA 2K, that's kind of the vibe of like how the story is so rapid fire and so random and so jarring. It's like, what is going on? Why is there so much happening? That they really felt like that, and I just think wait 10 more years. Maybe we could have just done this better.
Yeah, it's oddly the Aaron Hernandez story almost feels like it was undercovered at the time. Maybe I'm misremembering that, but to have a active NFL star be a serial killer, that's a pretty big deal. And somehow like it just became, another off the field NFL storyline. And now it almost feels like after the fact, like now it's almost being overcovered. Like we already have a bunch of documentaries about this. We already have a docuseries about it. And now we have a scripted television series about it. I don't know. It's just, and yeah, I mean, all those documentaries have elements of his shitty upbringing and potentially concussion issues and being gay, and how him, living in the macho world of football, how he might have coped with that. But all of it, everybody is a product of their life circumstances, and not everybody goes on to be a serial killer or a, however you want to phrase it.
And like, doesn't that almost kind of not understate, but like distract from the real like crisis of the CTE stuff? Because it's like, there's people who just die miserable and alone because of this thing. It's almost like, I guess, sensationalizing it, right? It's just like, this show is going to be the way we're going to talk about it as FX or as whatever, you know what I mean? And it's like, there's been no shortage of other coverage. I'm not trying to say that those stories are getting ignored, but it doesn't equal murderous tendencies. Most of the time, it just equals really shitty lives after you stop playing football, and pain and like memory loss and all these really, really real things, like Larry Johnson and people whose stories have really been talked about. It was weird. It felt almost insensitive because it was trying so hard to focus on that.
Yeah. And like you said, like there are real victims here, and there are real victims' families. And I don't know how you could watch the first two episodes or even the first episode and not think that like they are casting him in a sympathetic light. And maybe that will change as we get closer to the actual events that everybody's watching this for. But I just the entire project to this point has rubbed me the wrong way, and I haven't seen anything in the first two episodes to change that. I will give it kudos though on these two things, especially relating to the second episode, is they did an incredible job with the detail of the University of Florida and that roster. Like, just as somebody who remembers those teams, like they have, Aaron comes in as a true freshman. They have the guy who was ahead of him as the starting tight end. They have that guy's name and number on the jersey. They have, the third string defensive lineman. Like they have that. They have Cam Newton, who was like a third string quarterback. They have that roster.
Is he in the show? There's an actor playing Cam Newton. That's funny.
Yeah,
that alone makes me want to watch the episode.
Cam Newton is heavily featured in episode 2. And then the other thing that I thought was really funny was I saw a tweet that said that American Football Story has already done a more honest job of depicting Urban Meyer than the Untold Netflix series did. I thought that was pretty good.
Well, that's what I thought of when you were saying how much coverage of the Hernandez stuff that there has been. It is true. I think there were also like 2 narrative podcast series about it. Yep. One by the Boston Globe and one by somebody else. And I think I listened to most of the Boston Globe one. It was decent. But that that episode of the series got a ton of criticism for glossing over not only Hernandez, but any number of different things that were unsavory going on kind of beneath the surface at Florida. That obviously being the most significant one. And even Cam went on his podcast, or he went on Club Shay Shay and talked about it. And said that he was like, why can't we just be real, especially for a show that's called Untold, Let's tell what was not told in the moment. I wonder if it's just a little bit of maybe guilt on the part of some of these media types, or, we didn't catch this at the time. So now we have to double down and talk about it a ton. And then, some people are still missing the mark. I don't know. It is a massive story. But I guess we still haven't settled on how to talk about it, even if we're doing it in a lot of different places.
Yeah, in this, however we are supposed to talk about it, I can pretty confidently say that this American Football Story is not how we should be talking about it. And it's 10 episodes, right? So we are only 20% in. I do not know how they are going to stretch this thing out into 10 episodes, just seeing what they've already covered in the first 2 episodes, because so he was at Florida in 2007 and the murders happened in 2013, I think. This is going to be, there was
also the death at Florida, right? That never was fully explained. Is that in the 2nd episode? So maybe, if not, maybe that's the 3rd.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts out, the whole series starts with one shooting, which was insane.
It's there's some stuff that alludes to it. It's not fully outright covered, but okay. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where this goes from here.
Yeah, trial, everything else, we'll see. I probably will keep up with it. I don't know if I'll make it. We'll see, but interesting that they're doing it. We wanted to check in. All right, we'll close with our hot mics. Ben and I had the same one. So we'll tease. That one is related to the Dan Le Batard Show and a cool project they're doing. Before that, Lyndsey D'Arcangelo, a contributor at Awful Announcing, who has written a ton about the WNBA for the site this year. We're going to give our takeaways, talk through what on earth has been going on from a media standpoint with Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, the whole WNBA and beyond. That's coming up next. All right, very excited to be joined with our first guest ever here on the Play-by-Play by Lyndsey D'Arcangelo, a contributor at Awful Announcing, a longtime reporter and analyst on the WNBA, and an author as well. Lyndsey, you wrote a piece very timely for us here. We appreciate that, on this topic, which is basically we're going to do our best in 15 to 20 minutes to get through some of the lessons and takeaways we might be able to have from Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA, the uptick in attention around that online, in the TV viewership, and kind of everything else. And you referenced a quote from Cheryl Reeve on Sarah Spain's Good Game podcast over at iHeartRadio. Why don't you just walk us through kind of what Cheryl, the head coach of the Minnesota Lynx, who is, in the playoffs right now, trying to lead her team to a championship, said, and maybe that can be a jumping off point for some of our conversation today, just your takeaways on how she kind of spoke about this massive season, this massive year in the WNBA.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much about the growth and the attention and all of that. It was more about the toxic discourse that we've all seen taking place. Those are 2 separate things. I really, It's funny that you guys asked me on to talk about this because, just seeing some discourse this morning and what's happening going on with Dejanay Carrington and how she's being portrayed is the perfect example about this. Basically, what I wanted to write after I heard what Cheryl had to say about the discourse and how pretty much it's disheartening. It's disheartening after covering this league for a very long time and knowing where it came from to where it is now and how it has all been a collaborative effort to just increase its visibility, to legitimize what the players are doing now and what the players who have done in the past, all of it, to legitimize all of it, right? That's not saying that there wasn't constructive criticism, that we weren't holding the league accountable. It was all that, but it was done in a very respectful manner. Hot takes and opinions were challenged, but it was devoid of racism, misogyny, homophobic rhetoric, all of it. That was not a part of it. We had trolls, of course, but these were the guys who were bored and typing, go make me a sandwich. I mean, you can deal with that, when it starts to become what it has become this season. There's something so insidious about it. It's disheartening is probably the best word. And I wrote something from my own personal point of view of how I felt or saw it unfolding and how it affected me personally as somebody who has covered this league and felt very welcomed and respected and a valued voice. I have never used my block button on X more than I have this season. I've always been the type of person to be like, if you got something to say and you're willing to argue or not even argue, but have a discussion in good faith, by all means, share your opinion. But when it starts to go down this road of disparaging comments and verbal abuse, what are we doing? I just appreciated what she had to say, not only about the toxic discourse, but then where can we go from here? And that's what I wanted to write about.
Lyndsey, I'm wondering how you process this season for the WNBA, because on the one hand, you have unprecedented growth, unprecedented popularity. And on the other hand, it's almost like a be careful what you wish for, because like you said, it does bring a lot of this toxicity and bad faith discussions and, silly arguments on First Take and whatnot. I'm just wondering how you process all of that, and if it is a example of being careful what you wish for.
I mean, I guess so. But why should we accept a lower standard just because the league's more popular? Make that make sense to me. People are saying, well, and now it's like the NBA and this is what the NBA deals with. Well, good for the NBA. Why does that have to be what the WNBA deals with? Why do women's sports leagues have to accept the status quo just because they're more popular now? I don't believe that. A bar was set, right? As far as, how this league should be talked about, how the players should be respected as athletes, all of it. So why not accept everybody else to rise to that bar rather than lower it down? That doesn't make sense to me. And I believe it can exist that way. I mean, this whole this or that, why does that have to apply? Just because we're popular now, we have to accept, lower standards. No, it doesn't have to be. Who said that? Who made up that rule? Just because it's good for business, does that mean that we accept all this horrific rhetoric? Will that really take away from the business side of things? Honestly, what Caitlin Clark has done is amazing. She is a generational player. She is a player that this league has needed. They needed a season like this. We've seen it in men's sports. We've seen it in men's leagues constantly, right? Where you have certain seasons, certain players come in. Michael Jordan. I'm not comparing Caitlin Clark to Michael Jordan. I just want to say that. But those type of players who can just change the game and then bring all this extra attention and fandom. She is doing that. We needed this moment to move forward, to evolve in women's basketball. That's great. You can have that be true and not, take away from what all the players have done before her and how this league was built. I know Shannon Sharp said you said First Take that all the old guards and how this league was built. Well, what does that have to do with Caitlin Clark? I'll tell you what that has to do with Caitlin Clark. There would not be a league for her to play in if they didn't do what they did. So can it be like, yeah, let's give them all the credit in the world, and let's give Caitlin for taking that baton and to the next level. Let's embrace all of it. I don't like the division that is being sowed by parties who are doing it for clicks and engagement. And, you know, I'm very, I don't even know what the right word is for this, but I'm very like almost dejected by what I'm seeing as somebody who has covered women's sports for a while. And I honestly don't know. I don't know how we shift out of this when it has gotten so deep, other than we need a break. Like, I've enjoyed this WNBA season so much. There's been so many incredible performances, record-setting, individual teams. This could be Diana Taurasi's last season, Asia Wilson and what she has done. And yet we are still talking about the same things that were talked about at the beginning of the season.
Absolutely. I mean, just to, I guess, lay the foundation a little bit, this season also saw a 6x increase basically in the TV rights deal that was negotiated. We're headed toward a likely opt-out of the collective bargaining agreement. TV viewership is way up. At the same time, I want to draw attention to a quote that I saw. There was an in-depth piece on Ad Age, which is not a place I'm often reading, but it was about the WNBA and kind of how ESPN and ABC are approaching the postseason. And this quote stuck out to me as an example of, I think, the frustration that comes from that old guard you mentioned that Shannon Sharp had some words for, Lyndsey, but also media like yourself who have been doing this for longer. And he said to I can't remember the reporter, I'll say it in a moment. We paid next to nothing and got so much value over the last couple of years. The bill is coming due now that advertising competition is rising with the intensity of competition in the league. Basically, this article laid out how the league is charging more, or the ESPN and ABC are charging more for ad rates for this postseason in the WNBA than they do for like MLB playoff games. And they're getting it, and they're sold out. Even with the Fever potentially being 2 and out, Caitlin might not even be part of this whole thing, and they're still getting this. But I just thought that it's a small quote, but it is exactly the frustration that you hear from tons of these people. It's not only that Caitlin Clark did all these things, but there was a threshold that wasn't being met, even if you just looked at value and very cut and dry, financial and economic terms, that she got them to. Yes, because there was some permission given to now go ahead and do that on the parts of these businesses. But that credit being given to her, I think, is one of the problems. And we can zoom out from ad sales and just look at it as attention, just care, treating the sport like something that mattered. And I think we see this a lot, right? We see this in all walks of life. The people that kind of are in charge, like a Stephen A. Smith. I mean, he's not in charge of sports media, but he's the closest thing to it. He sets the agenda, the tone, the format of how these things are talked about. In order to justify his own ignorance of this stuff for a long time, he has to tell you it didn't matter before, right?
Yes.
And that's what we saw in First Take in May when him and Monica McNutt and Shanae Agumike kind of had it out a little bit. And you hear it on Colin Cowherd's show. He often says, he gives himself credit for covering it, and he says, but the product's gotten better. It's more watchable now. I want to see it. And it's not really true, and there's no evidence given, but it's just, well, I wasn't paying attention, so therefore it must not have mattered. You know what I mean? Because I'm Colin Cowherd. I'm Stephen A. Smith. I know what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a huge dynamic that we've seen. And it's funny you mentioned Cheryl Reeve. I wrote an article kind of after that blow up with Stephen A. and Monica, that I interviewed Cheryl in 2021 for a story for my previous job about sports media and women's sports media in particular. And the thing that really opened my eyes, that the way that she put it, was, yes, there is always going to have to be, when you're convincing ESPN or Amazon or anybody else to pay for your broadcast rights or whatever it might look like, that you have to get the average sports fan, men, white dudes, older white dudes, to watch. You got to. That's just part of, there's too many of that type of person that you can't ignore it. But what she said is like, look at the numbers of young women sports participation. Girls who play softball, girls who play volleyball, girls who whatever. That's going up over time a lot. And, you know, not even 8-year-olds, but what about 15-year-olds? What about 22-year-olds? That group, that metric never gets measured really when we're talking about this stuff. And I think when we start to think about like, how do you say no to just getting swallowed up by First Take or The Herd or the normal nonsense that we cover on Awful Announcing? It's like, how do you tap into some of those audiences that don't even get factored into the discussion? And that's probably the people who, you know, are being awakened the most when you see some of these viewership numbers go up, or even attendance in all these places. I don't know the answer. I kind of have a feeling and an unfortunate feeling that like maybe WNBA and women's sports media just, I mean, I don't say this with criticism, but they weren't ready. The league wasn't ready. Sports media wasn't ready. There weren't these things stood up to say, let's have these conversations. So First Take just gets to set that agenda like it does with everything, even if that's probably not the healthiest place to have that happen. But, you know, I guess, Lyndsey, what do you feel like, what goes through your mind when you kind of do look forward? One, in the short term of just, how do you said we need a break, but does a break solve this, or is it just we stop arguing for a while and we go right back to it? And then I guess longer term, like, what would you kind of like to see that evolution look like?
Well, just I want to agree with something. Like, I do believe that Caitlin Clark should get a lot of credit for helping bring more eyes. I mean, her style of play, there's a lot of growth that needs to happen with her. I believe from a maturity level standpoint, I'd love to see her not lose her cool as much. I think becoming the face of a league is a bigger responsibility than she maybe realized. And she has said and done everything right up until this point. But I do believe there's going to come to a point, it's going to come to a head where she's going to have to be more vocal, especially in this league, when the players themselves have used their platforms and their own autonomy to enact change. And they are the reason this league has evolved and become what it is today. From a diversity standpoint, from, you know, speaking out when it comes to politics. You know, I'm not saying she has to go and do those things, but she's going to have to find her footing and where she fits into that, which will come in time, no doubt. But here's where historical context matters, right? There were lots of factors working against the WNBA that people don't talk about. They don't talk about on First Take. They don't talk about that. There's an article that came out, I believe it's Sports Media Watch. I just read it before hopping on here with you guys, but there was an exec who didn't want to put the WNBA on ESPN because he didn't watch it. He didn't watch it. So like you said, with Stephen A. and Shannon, they think what they believe is canon, that a lot of people view or have the same perception. So because this exec didn't like women's basketball or what it was, didn't enjoy it for whatever reason, fine for him. But for him to be making those decisions to take away viewership and potential growth because he didn't want to put him on television, that has nothing to do with the product. That's a personal opinion weighing into a business decision. And I can tell you with certainty, he's not the only one. There's been factors and incidents like that throughout this league's history. And that's why I say historical context matters. You have to factor in it all. You can't just talk about the league like it just blew up today. When have we ever talked about sports leagues ever, especially on the men's sides, where you're just holding it to what it is today? It just, to answer your question about going forward, I do believe there's enough people like me who will continue to use their voice and to try to do it with integrity. I tweeted about this morning. I refuse to play this game where, you write headlines, you aggregate content, you produce clickbaity stuff, and that's considered journalism. maybe it's me and it's my age or being around, haven't been around women's sports for a while, but I don't want to compromise my integrity. And I feel like there needs to be more of us to take a stand and to do it the right way. I don't know how else we shift out of it. Monica McNutt held Stephen A. accountable. Has she been back on that show since?
She hasn't.
Has
I
she
actually
appeared?
have a little bit of context there. She has not, but I actually have spoken with her, and she has been invited. It just genuinely didn't work out. Because around this time, people like to throw out that she was banned, so I checked in. She
don't believe she was banned, but I mean, I do believe having a voice who's contrarian, the whole platform where what you say goes and you can just shout at people and there's no nuance to these conversations. What does that provide in a larger context when it comes to talking about sports? How does that enlighten minds or get people to think differently or look at different opinions? It does nothing. It does nothing but you get video clips and views. I don't know on a larger scale how things can change because social media has become this, in Twitter especially. Now you're getting paid for the engagement that you're getting. Again, I just feel like, and Cheryl said this too, there's enough people like her, like players and coaches and people around the league who value what it is and what it still can be, and without all this nonsense aside to it. As far as taking a break from what I said, I do believe the next rookie class with Paige Beckers and more people coming in will help bring in more fans, but also shift some of these pockets of division that we're seeing, because there'll be more to talk about and more spread around. And then the class after that, really time. I think it's just going to take time.
Do you think the solution, I mean, definitely time, but also more coverage moving forward? Because we've spent a lot of time talking about First Take, and like, as a football fan, if I want good football talk or good football analysis, I don't go to First Take. Like, I know where I can get good football or good NBA analysis, and it's not First Take. And I've noticed, more WNBA podcasts popping up. I've noticed, ESPN devoting more time in its typical NBA Today slot to talking about the WNBA. I don't know, like, where the WNBA stands when it comes to advanced analytics and things of that nature. But I guess on the other side, you are going to get more content aggregators. You are going to get more clickbaity articles. So there's some push and pull there. But do you think more coverage is a good thing or a bad thing for the league?
No, I definitely think it's a good thing. And I think another frustrating thing about all this is that more media companies are getting in on this. They want a share of the engagement that clicks, but they don't want to invest in good quality content and analysis. Like you said, they don't want to pay full-time staffers and support them. I mean, we only have a few beat writers with each team that exist in this league right now. That's going to have to change. There is more room for more podcasts and more analysts. There's room for women's sports history to be talked about on a larger scale. There's space for this coverage, but media companies are going to have to buck up and invest and spend the money to do so. If they want to continue and head down this road where it's going to increase and get bigger and better, content aggregation will only do so much. I think, and I see this in conversations with people, people get tired of it. They get tired of engaging in this way. Eventually, you hit a wall. But I do believe it's needed. Like you said, WNBA Countdown, their viewership, their numbers have gone up, and that's a quality program. That's a high quality program, and we need more of it.
I think that's a great place to end. I do want to just shout out, Deep Blue and iHeart's slate of shows. I think Sarah Spain's done a really good job. We've covered it quite a bit here, and they're going to continue to expand, not just in basketball, but in other places. And they, I got to be around some of their launch stuff around WNBA All-Star Weekend when it was here in Phoenix, and they seem to be, it's not just an attachment to this or some trial project. It seems to be a very genuine and real investment. So that's the type of thing we're talking about: permanent, real, invested in types of coverage. And yeah, hopefully time. I mean, right now it's, you see a lot of, just to speak to some of that aggregation side of it, a lot of it is just they're treating this league like a culture war right now. It's covered the same way that, something Donald Trump says is going to be covered. It gets aggregated in the same nonsense way that is so detached from sports, which is, in my opinion, pretty unique. Like, you see the occasional Brittany Mahomes stuff in the NFL, but you're also going to just say a highlight of a great catch. And that part is almost absent in the mainstream coverage. It's a lot of just the nonsense, which
that's what I think has been interesting is Caitlin, by all indications, lived up to these unrealistic expectations coming into.
She surpassed them in my book.
Right. Yeah. And that's somehow become a footnote in the entire conversation whenever we talk about
It's
her.
also doing a disservice to what she's done this year. I mean, that's what her play, the numbers she put up, the record she broke, amazing. And yet that's becoming secondary to all this other nonsense, to her getting poked in the eye accidentally by Dejanay Carrington. And now it's become, part of the culture war.
Yeah.
How many times have we seen players poked in the eye in the course of a basketball game? It blows my mind. And it's, if you are a true Caitlin Clark fan, I'd be frustrated on her behalf that she is getting, her talent is getting surpassed by this other nonsense.
We can and will continue to stay on this topic. There's no shortage of tentacles that have come out of it. We'll go into another college season, and before we know it, it'll be the WNBA once again. The postseason is still going on, though. We'll see who comes out victorious and what the attention and storylines end up being as we continue through October. Thank you so much for joining us, Lyndsey. Ben and I will wrap up next, folks, with our Hot Mic segment where we dish on something that caught our attention in the world of sports media. And we'll talk to you in a moment. All right, Ben, last but not least, our Hot Mic segment where we bring something to the show that caught our attention in the world of sports media this week. You and I were mapping this out right before. Turns out we had the same exact idea. And it is the Dan Le Batard Show with Stugotz's oral history. It's their 20th anniversary, and they're going back to the absolute beginning and producing this series with clips and stories and interviews detailing how this thing that is now pretty huge in the sports world got here, starting from a tiny little second-tier radio station in Miami to this. So I think your history with this show goes back longer than mine, and you listened to it as well. What did you think of the first episode?
Yeah, so my history with the show goes back to 2011. I was a frustrated Cleveland Cavaliers fan and taking all the joy that I possibly could in the Dallas Mavericks beating the Heat in the NBA Finals with LeBron falling on his face. And I tuned in to the Dan Le Batard Show because I really wanted to hear Dan, for as loud and boisterous as he was about the Heat, I wanted to hear him eat it. And so I turned on the Dan Le Batard Show with Stugotz, and they spent the entire first segment, I think, talking about the Miami Dolphins. They didn't even mention the Heat once, just, as a troll job, because I'm sure they knew people like me were tuning in to hear them do that. But listening to the oral history, which that goes back to 2004, so 7 years before I even started watching or listening, is just such a nostalgic trip down memory lane. It even started with their old intro from 790 The Ticket, and they did a fun spoof on that. And that's what stood out to me. I fell in love with the show from there. I was listening to Miami Heat pregame shows throughout LeBron's entire run in Miami because I just fell so in love with this universe of the Le Batard universe, really. And it had such a distinct sound for a local radio show. I would listen to it on my TuneIn app, and on the off chance I would be in South Florida, it was always such a treat to get to listen to it over the airwaves. But it's really cool they're doing this. The show has such a storied history by this point. All of the personalities and former producers, Mark Hochman especially, who's featured pretty prominently on that first episode. But to just hear how this show came together and the unlikeliness of it all coming together, and not only that, but lasting now for 20 years. It's really cool that they did this, I think.
There's some spaces where, like you mentioned, and you remember Troy Aikman, where our age does show. I don't remember Troy Aikman. In this case, I can't blame that. I was just late to the party. I think I just never, truly what I can blame, which circularly kind of connects back to this, is I don't have creative, interesting sports talk here in Phoenix. We have one station we always have, which sucks in the first place because there's just no reason to adapt and try stuff. It's just stuffy guys who have been doing the same show. I really like our morning show. They've really gotten good, but they weren't even in the universe when I was first, a teenager and everything. So I just never really got on board with sports talk radio, unfortunately. Like that was kind of absent from my life. So I didn't ever think, oh, I'll love this. I knew it was out there. They're very popular online. I was aware of the world. I saw the clips and everything else, but I really hooked onto it during COVID, honestly. It's been a lot shorter. And then obviously when they jumped to being independent, and I really loved their first few months of being independent, which I'm sure were crazy stressful for them, but they just had these long meandering segments. Everything was just completely whatever they wanted to talk about with no structure. And that was kind of awesome for, the time. And I was getting a new job. It just really worked with my schedule. I was in like an office 9-to-5 job. I needed something to distract me and be on in the car when I was driving and all that sort of stuff. So it's a lot shorter. But it's, I told my wife when the first episode came out, this is porn. I showed her the thing and I was like, this is both for liking the show, but also just for what we do for a living, to just hear the nuts and bolts of how they built up this thing, which you don't get a lot of times from these other hosts, because not a lot of them started in that same way with the same construction of the show. Colin Cowherd, obviously be interesting to hear, but it's really just about how Colin Cowherd jumped up to all these different jobs. It's just the Colin Cowherd story. There's only so much really intrigue there. They ported this thing over from all these different places to now being independent, and that story is really fascinating. But yeah, it was really cool as somebody who was more new to it to go back and just hear how revolutionary some of just the core components of how they do the show were. You know what I mean? Because to me, it's just normal. That's just how the Batard Show does it. And I do notice that the other local shows don't, but, even to realize that they had to kind of try stuff and take risks and whatever, it's just, it's honestly just, to me, that first episode so far, we'll see, they're going to be every 2 weeks. It was just an awesome, dive into super creative people just at the ground floor. That's really it.
Yeah. And, anniversaries can be kind of arbitrary in how we celebrate them and what we decide is an important anniversary. But the idea of not only a radio show lasting for 20 years in today's environment, and they went from local to ESPN to national or to independent, is that's wild in and of itself. But to have two hosts who have been together this whole time, I cannot think of, two hosts who have actively been together for the last 20 years, the way that Dan and Stugotz have. And Mike Ryan's probably not far behind them in terms of being a consistent voice on the show. And the show has really had a lot of, even if you go back 10 years ago, the cast, they've obviously made additions and some changes, but the show has largely remained the same. It's been the same universe. And, but you're right. To hear how they went from a show where it was going to be Stugotz driving it, and Stugotz was 32 years old, which is insane to think about him starting not only a show, but a radio station at 32 years old. But to go from that point to where they were able to ultimately take it independent post ESPN in 2021, it's really going to be a fascinating journey to follow. And I'm really excited because they're so transparent on the air about the behind the scenes happenings of the show, but it seems like this is going to be the deepest dive we've gotten yet. So it's really the show within the show. And that's always been the big part of the appeal of the Dan Le Batard Show.
Yeah. It's a very them project to be doing, but it is great so far. First episode was an hour and a half and I ate up every minute of it. It's funny. I have a naivete with some of this stuff where I assume that really pioneering smart people, creative people like Dan, that they just had the whole thing in their head from the beginning, that it's just so natural to them. So I'm hopeful that we can hear more granularly what things, because they always say he didn't want to do a normal show. I'm curious, what did he not like? What did he want to do? I have my own thoughts because I listen and watch and consume the show, but just to think what aspects of radio? Okay, the callers, they talk a little bit about that. He didn't want to have the normal, format of like hearing, idiots in their car just say whatever for 10 minutes, which can get boring. But I don't know, like I really loved how David Letterman did this, and I just think that it's also instructive for, I think like if I'm a kid and doing my college radio station and I'm listening to this, I'm like, my eyes are being opened. I don't just have to guess and try to live up to the 20-year-old version of the Dan Le Batard Show. I can be like, here's how they were thinking about it, and I'm sure people's wheels are turning. So it's really cool that they're doing it. It's really it's like also a humility that you don't often see, to be able to go back and say, we sucked at this and here's how we got better and here's what we tried and we weren't always awesome,
Yeah, no, for sure. How long did it take you to get into the show? I'm curious, and this is probably an entire different episode, so we can probably wrap here soon. But like, I always have trouble recommending the show because it's so based on inside jokes and that sense of community, and it can be easy to feel like you're an outsider when you first start listening to it.
That definitely held me back for a while. I would say that's why from like when I was in college till when I finally gave it a try that I didn't, even though so many people that I knew I liked their content or I got along with them recommended it and liked it. I was like, I know I'm going to like this thing, but it's like their literal catchphrase is that you don't get the show. So I was like, I'm probably not going to get the show. Why am I going to, so yeah, there were a few months at the beginning where I was like, I don't know who's talking. I don't know what these things mean. I am lost, but I still like, I don't even think there was much of a trial period. I kind of dipped in once or twice. And then within a couple weeks, I was just inhaling it pretty much every hour. And I will say it's dipped since I got this job because I have to consume other stuff. So I actually watch it less, which is kind of funny that I paid to do it and actually do it less. But, yeah, it's been 4 years basically of like, constant at this point.
Yeah, it's like the inside jokes become so contagious. Like me and my wife still wish each other happy birthday with the Stephen A. Smith sounder. So like it's just once you're in, you're in. And I think it's funny that it draws a lot of comparisons to Pardon My Take because they're both shows that don't take sports super seriously. And I often hear about Le Batard like ripping off Pardon My Take. And there's obviously some natural like overlap there, but I mean, they've been doing this for 20 years. And aside from maybe that first year, it's by and large been the same formula ever since.
We will definitely check in on this again, at the very least, when it is all over and done. I don't know how long this series will go, but they have promised every 2 weeks of hour-plus long episodes, and we will be consuming them, if that wasn't clear already, here on the Play-by-Play. That's it for this week, a jumbo episode. Thank you so much to Lyndsey D'Arcangelo. Awesome conversation. Hit follow, subscribe on your favorite podcast feed, wherever you're finding us, if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out awfulannouncing.com. We have daily content on all of this stuff. And we'll catch you guys next week.